Welcome to the Simple Doesn't Mean Easy podcast. We are here weekly working at simplifying things in our lives one day at a time, one simple step at a time. It's the best way to do it, guys. I'm your host, Michelle Visser, and today is a continuation, a part two of sorts. We started with our episode last week talking about this amazing way that backyard gardeners can improve their soil and actually do dual or triple purpose while they're improving their soil. And it's something that's not talked about enough. And I have put together some resources for folks who are looking for answers, like I was a few years ago, to help you understand more about cover crops for the home garden. They've been talked about a lot on the big scale, big pharma, big pharma. Why did I say that? Big agriculture, big farmers, big farms have been using cover crops for, I was going to say for decades, but honestly, probably since the beginning of time, since there has been farming, which has been since the beginning, there have probably been cover crops. So it's nothing new, but in the past few decades, we have seen talk about it for big scale, but not for small backyard farmers. And it's a disservice. It's something that can really help us in our backyard gardens, and we need to understand it. So that's what we're doing in the last episode and this one, talking through this whole topic of cover crops. So in the last episode, we talked about the way that I decided to break down into three different categories, the cover crops. And I went through each category and we talked about what my personal favorite cover crop was in each category. We talked about the benefits that some of those categories have over other ones. And we just also talked about some general things to know about each category. And I shared with you how you can plant cover crops and not lose the amount of food that you're going to be growing, because that's a big obstacle that we tend to think we're going to lose growth time. We're not going to be able to grow our own food to maturity if we have to clear the garden in time to plant for cover crops. So we talked through that in last episode, how I do it, how it works best for me. I don't know if I mentioned, so I'll mention now that another thing is to keep in mind it's okay if the cover crop doesn't get to maturity. It is still doing all those many things that we talked about, that it's helping your soil, and you're still going to have nutrients to turn into the soil, even if it's not the plant at its full mature growth. So don't worry. If you don't have the full time needed because you have a short growing season like I do as well, it's okay. You're still going to reap a lot of benefits from cover crops. Also, if you want to know, well, what is the ideal time, Michelle? If you have a long growing season and you want to have the ideal, biggest bang for your buck, most impact from your cover crop, when should you terminate the cover crops? And by the way, that's one of the things we're going to cover today. In fact, I hesitated what to call this because I thought, if I call this episode How to Inoculate and Terminate Your Cover Crops, it sounds kind of like, I don't know, gangsterish or something. We're going to be terminating and inoculating. Um, so, but those are the main things we're talking about. And also specifically how to prepare your ground and plant the cover crop, and how to know when to terminate it. So since I'm randomly spewing this information out in no particular order, let's start with that. How do you know when the plant has reached its mature state, when it's the best time to terminate the cover crop? Basically, right before it goes to bloom. Once the plant starts to bloom, it is putting all of its energy and all of its nutrients into that bloom and maybe potentially whatever fruit it's going to produce. So it's not going to have as much nutrients in the plant itself. Also, if you let it go to bloom, then you very well could risk the chance that you're going to have seeds forming. They're going to be scattering across your garden, and maybe you'll be fighting this particular cover crop in future years where you don't want it to be growing. So, there's lots of reasons to not let it go to seed. Don't let it go to bloom. But as soon as you see the buds starting to form, that's when you want to terminate the crop because the plant is loaded with the highest amount of nutrients you're going to be able to get out of that plant. And ideally, depending on what your use is for the cover crop, you probably want those nutrients to go back into your soil. So if you terminate the cover crop at that point and let the nutrients decay on your soil, that's when you're getting the most nutrient value. So, how do you plant your cover crop? Now, let's move on to that. It's actually very simple. You, although I told you last episode, I messed up in every way the first time I planted cover crops. I don't know why, but I really thought I wanted to have rows for my cover crops. So I literally planted one single row of clover, left a few inches, planted another single row of clover. It's much better, much more effective to scatter your seeds. It's a lot easier to get them planted. And you want a dense growth of this cover crop to get the most dense value of nutrients and all the other benefits that it provides, like helping with erosion. You're going to get more erosion help from this crop if you scatter the seeds and you have a dense growth. So before you scatter your seeds, though, of course, you have to prepare your soil. It's super easy, not at all complicated, exactly what you would expect. You need to clear the area, take out any plants or old growth, rid the area of any weeds, and remove debris like rocks, pine cones, leaves. Get all of it out and clear it. And then level your soil as level as you can get it. And at that point, I actually like to add an amendment if I'm doing it. I will often do it in the spring and the fall. Some years I choose to just do one or the other, but I will often add some mineral light amendment, which we talked about pretty extensively last episode, and I've mentioned it previously. Um, and if you go to solirested.com/soil, I link to it there. You can see what I'm talking about if you don't know. But it's a great time to add that amendment to give that extra spark to your soil before you plant your cover crop. I will water the amendment. I'll usually let it sit for a day, come back and put in my cover crop. I really don't know if that's necessary. I just kind of feel like I just want to give it a little bit of a time to work in before I add the seed. Anyway, so then you scatter your cover crop and it's best to not walk on the seed after you've scattered it. You want to rake it in lightly and water it, but it's best to not walk on it and squish it down into the ground too deeply. So you want to do this in strips, depending on the size of the area that you're doing and the shape of it. You might need to be a little creative. I like to actually do it when possible with someone helping me because then one of us can be scattering and the other one going right behind and lightly raking in the seed. So it's very easy to know where you've been. Sometimes, if you have a long area you're doing it in, you might wind up kind of going crooked with your scattering and you're not quite sure when you go back, wait, which section was I working on? And it's not always easy to see depending on your seed. Some of the seeds are the color of the soil, so you really can't tell where you've been, if that makes sense. But you don't need two people. You can certainly do it by yourself. But anyway, so you prepare the soil, you scatter the seed and rake it in, and then you water it. And you do want to water it daily until it has really germinated and sprouted well and it's looking good. Even then, I often will water daily unless, we're getting the morning dew and it's getting enough that way. But that's it. That's how you plant cover crops. And there is another step though for one of these three types: the legumes, the grasses, and the brassicas. For the legumes, there's an added step. It's super easy, but it's also very important. I alluded to this some last episode, and I told you I was going to wait until now because I wanted to have time to explain it. It's really, really cool. I also had mentioned last episode that legumes are fantastic at adding nitrogen to your soil. They are called a nitrogen fixing crop. These are things like beans and peas and clover. And I had said that they pull nitrogen out of the air. And then I also said that's not really correct. And I'm going to have to explain more next week. So the plant itself can't do that. It can't pull the nitrogen from the air and put it in the soil. But there are strands of good bacteria that's what their job is. They pull the nitrogen from the air and use it in the soil. Now, sometimes this bacteria, I mean, it does always occur naturally in nature and it will be in your soil, but most often it will not exist in a high enough quantity for your legume cover crop to really do the great job of nitrogen fixing that you're looking for. So, if you're going to plant legumes and you're doing it to increase your nitrogen, you absolutely want to do this extra step. You want to get some inoculant. The inoculant is a rhizobium bacteria. The rhizobium bacteria is actually doing this really cool thing with your cover crop. It works in a symbiotic relationship with your seeds. And you learned about this back in middle school science, right? And how symbiosis works. It's so cool in nature to see it. It's so neat to see how God designed these relational systems throughout nature to benefit both ends of the relationship and then often to benefit others, right? Like us and our garden. So, what happens is the bacteria pulls the nitrogen from the air and uses it and converts it. And then the plant has the nitrogen it needs desperately. And the plant, meanwhile, takes that nitrogen, makes food, and sends out through their roots things that the rhizobium bacteria need. So they work hand in hand. They actually form a little nodule in many places on the roots of the plant where the exchange is happening. So you'll know that your cover crops did their job and added nitrogen to the soil, not only by doing a soil test, which, by the way, we talked about that pretty extensively last episode as well. So definitely get yourself a soil test. Go to solelyrested.com/soil for more information and a discount code on that. But not only will the test help you know about all of the nutrients in your soil and if your nitrogen levels are increasing and doing well. But also, if you see those little nodules and bumps on the roots of your legume cover crop, that's a sign that things are happening as they're supposed to. That symbiotic relationship is going on, and your soil is building up its much needed nitrogen. So it's pretty cool. Now, how do you get this rhizobium in your soil? Really simple. When you get your seeds out and you're getting ready to plant, you do want to wait until right before you're going to plant. Don't do it more than an hour or two before you're going to be in the garden and getting these seeds in the soil. But you put your seeds in a bowl or a small bucket and you spray them very lightly with a spray bottle of water. So just mist them with water. And then you very lightly shake a little bit of this bacteria on the seeds. It's a very fine black powder, and you just need a tiny bit. You just lightly add some to the top, and then I just use my hands, mix it in so that it's lightly coating all the seed, and then you're ready. It's that simple. You've inoculated your seed. It's ready to go do its job and do some nitrogen fixation in your soil. It's that simple. And it works. It really works. So I promised you, along with talking about how to plant the cover crops and how to inoculate your legumes, we would get into the biggest obstacle of all. We're going to talk about what on earth do you do with these cover crops in the spring? Because, of course, come spring, your garden has another purpose. Your garden is now full on there to give food to your family. So the cover crops need to go. I want to pause right here with a question for you. We talk a lot here on the show about how important simple little things can be and how one simple change can really make a huge impact over time. But do we think about the some of the most basic simplest things in our kitchen? Do we think about the ingredient that we probably use the most and do we make sure that we're choosing the best? I'm talking about salt. And I know when you go to the store, there are a lot of choices in front of you. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I eliminated every other choice. There is only one choice for me, and that is Redmond real salt. And actually, it's a fascinating topic that if you want to go to episode 142, we get into a whole lot of detail about the myths about salt and why real salt is important. But let me just tell you right now, please go to solely rested, SOULY rested.com/salt, because I want to share with you more details about this company and an amazing discount code that you can use anytime, all the time. And I've listed my 9 all time favorite products that I always have in my kitchen from Redmond Real Salt. Believe it or not, they have a lot more than just salt, guys. Go check out these 9 products. Go to soulyrested.com/salt and make sure you enjoy that discount code as well. I want to ask if you are ready for the holidays. They are quickly approaching, and it's time to think about if you can be a little more intentional this holiday season. I know it's my goal to be more intentional than I typically am, hoping that the holidays don't just fly by without me really giving good thought to some things that are important to me, specifically gift giving. I don't want to give frivolous things that just provide something for the recipient to open. I want to give intentional gifts, ones that are promoting health and wellness, ones that are encouraging fulfilling hobbies and activities, ones that are getting the family together, and ones that are, of course, focused on healthy, real food. So, if you'd like to see what I'm giving as gifts this year, I would love to share the guide with you. Go to Souly Rested, SOULY rested.com/holiday. And I'm going to share with you some of my unusual, but I think gifts that will be very appreciated this year. Please go check it out, soulyrested.com/holiday. How do you do it? There are essentially 6 ways to terminate your cover crops. But the fact is, a lot of these work hand in hand. And in most cases, you're going to use multiple ways together. So I guess there is one option of these 6 that you're never going to use in tandem with anything else. Maybe I'll start with that. You can purchase and plant cover crops that are winter killed cover crops. These are the more delicate, tender plants that don't do well in freezing temperature, and they will naturally be killed by the cold weather. I guess if you live too far south, this isn't an option. Hadn't really thought about that because it definitely works well here in New Hampshire. Um, it's definitely the easiest way to terminate your crop. It requires no work at all on your part in the spring. But of course, it's not really effective if you live in New England and you can't plant your cover crop until September. There's no way it's going to be mature or even anywhere close before it dies by the end of October when the frosts are heavy. So it all depends on where you live if this will work for you, but it is something to keep in mind because if you plant these tender crops and they do their job in late summer and then come winter they totally die. In the spring, you literally just have to clear off the mat that they've left of just the dead plant material. Just clear that off and it's done. Your soil is ready to be planted. It's great. Like it's easiest effort of all when it comes to cover crops. So I'll use this method if I ever can, which isn't really too often, but when if a garden crop does die off early and or it's been eaten by predators and I have the empty space early on, this is a great option. I will choose a cover crop that's going to die in the cold temperatures. Mustard is one of them. And I can then have a really easy spring in that section, at least, of the garden where I used that kind of a cover crop. So that's one of the 6 ways. The next one is weed whacking. If you are planting a really large area of cover crops, you would, of course, use like a tractor or maybe a mower. But if you have a smaller garden or a raised bed, then you can weed whack to break down the top of your cover crop that's above the soil. Um, this really helps with the termination process. It usually is not going to be the only termination process you use, but it could be. If you're planting a really hardy bunch of seedlings that are really mature, you've grown inside, they're nice and tall and strong, it could be that you could clear enough area for each seedling, like just clear a circle amidst all of the roots that you've left there of your cover crop and go ahead and plant with all the top of that removed. Then it could be that your plants will thrive. Tomatoes could do pretty well in this. I've never done it this way, but I've seen other gardeners. I have a friend that does it this way, so I know it works. I haven't done it, but like I said, it also depends on what you're planting there. You certainly could not only weed whack and then plant a something from seed because it's just not going to work. But in that case, you could use the weed whacking in tandem with the next option I'm going to tell you about. Um, you do want to not let your cover crops get too tall because the weed whacking, of course, gets more difficult then. So that's another negative to that. But the next option, so this will be our third one, is you can turn over your cover crops. If it's a small growing cover crop, like a low growing clover, um, or if you didn't plant it early enough that the crop has gotten to maturity, it's just grown a small amount, you could turn it over without doing anything else. You don't have to break off the top. You don't have to weed whack or mow the top. You could just get your shovel and turn everything over into the dirt. But if your cover crop has grown taller than that, of course, you might need to break it off on the top and then turn it over. It actually usually takes less time than you would think. I remember the first time I heard that, I'm like, well, that's going to take me weeks to turn over by shovelful my entire garden. But it really doesn't because you're not dealing with the weeds. And I mean, it depends on the cover crop. I'm sure there are some cover crops that this would be complicated if the weeds are really, the roots are really intense. But I'm always shocked at how quickly this process goes because it is simply the cover crops. They're a tender plant at this point still. And I guess maybe the cover crops I've chosen don't have a lot of deep roots, which would help. But I find it actually works very easily, and there's nothing else in your garden. There's no other weeds. There's none of those nasty weeds that can be really a pain that you have to, like a big taproot that you have to dig down and get out because the cover crops have kept them from growing. And of course, you got the soil ready and level and free of debris before you planted the cover crops. So you don't have any of that to remove either. If you're doing this with a raised bed, you might want to just use like a turning fork to do this instead of a shovel. But the fourth way would be to knock over the cover crops. This is also called crimping, but it's really just as simple as literally knocking over the plants. Now, depending on what the plant is, you might be able to just knock it over, like step on it and push it down, or you might want to get some shears, some garden shears, and cut it off at ground level. But it's very seldom, as with weed whacking, a standalone termination method because you want to use it hand in hand, typically with something else. It could be the first step to tarping, which is the next one we're going to get to. If you're using a tool that scratches up the plant as it gets flattened like a roller crimper or I think it's called a harrow, you'll get the best results and you'll shorten how long you need to keep the crops covered with the tarp if you do tarp as your second step. So tarping is your fifth option of how to terminate your cover crops. A large tarp just placed right on top of your cover crop works really great at killing the plants. You just need to give it a few weeks to work through the process. Depending on the temperature, depending on how much sun you have, that time varies, but typically a couple weeks. And you do need to have some sort of bricks or cinder blocks to line up around the tarp to keep it down so the wind isn't going to blow it and it's going to hold in the air and the heat from the sun. Um, so it's of course blocking the light that's getting to your plants. It's stopping the airflow, and all of those things combine together to kill off the cover crop. If your temperatures don't rise above 50, maybe or so, you might find you need longer. You might find you need like 3 weeks for this to work. But another option, the final one we're going to mention, the sixth option, is to use solar power or solarize it, which sounds a lot fancier than it is. It's really just tarping with a clear tarp, some sort of a clear material that's going to allow the sun's heat to really permeate even more into the roots of your cover crop and kill them so they decompose. But of course, this only works if you have sunny days and if you have a pretty warm temperature at the time. For our spring summers here in New Hampshire, it would probably never be effective unless it's a crazy unusual year. But Also, another problem with this, I guess, is if you leave your cover crop in this intense greenhouse effect, if you have lots of sunny, warm days, if you leave it in that for too long, it's actually going to sterilize your soil, which, if you had a lot of fungus and disease, it could be a good thing. That is one way to get rid of fungus in your soil to sterilize it. But the negative is you're also killing all those good microorganisms, all the good bacteria that you want in there to help your plants and to feed your plants. So, if you choose the Solarize option, realize it's going to speed up your process, but also keep in mind you need to be careful or you could go overboard with that. But it can definitely work and it can work well. So, that is the list of 6 ways to terminate your cover crops. Some people ask, well, is another option just to pull them out? And I mean, the answer is yes, that's always an option, but it's not what I would choose unless what you mean is you're going to pull it out and let it lay and decompose and then turn it back into your soil. But that's pretty much the same thing that I've already said. So, um, if you're going to pull it out to feed some farm animals, I wouldn't pull it out by the roots. I would cut it off at the soil level, give that food to the farm animals, but let the roots decompose in the dirt if possible, because at least the nutrients of the roots will then impact your soil. Some people also ask, well, how long does it take for all of this to work, to make a difference? Believe it or not, it works pretty quickly. Cover crops, on one hand, it's a long game. Like, you want to continue doing this, you want to rotate your cover crops like you rotate your other crops, and you want to stick with it for a long term great result. But on the other hand, it can work pretty quickly, especially depending on what your problems are. If your problems are erosion or weeds, I mean, of course, it works right away because it keeps both of those things from happening, because you have a dense cover crop on your dirt instead of weeds growing or the rain washing away the dirt. So they work well, and they work effectively pretty quickly. And I think that's, I'm looking, I don't have anything else here on my notes. So I think that's everything I wanted to tell you between last episode and this one. Phew, I think we covered it, guys. And I hope that I convinced you to at least look into this more and consider the option, because it has done really great things for our gardens. And I've been really pleased with it. I just wish it didn't take me so long to figure it all out. I wish I didn't take years and years to go, I don't understand that whole cover crop thing. Maybe someday I'll maybe try it. I wish it hadn't taken me years and years. I wish I had just really dug my heels in and just tried it. I didn't have the resources that I now have for you guys. Go to solirested.com/soil. So I hope those help you a lot. But even without those resources, looking back, I should have just did it. Just try it. If you choose like not the perfect cover crop, that's okay. If the cover crop never reaches maturity, that's okay. If you choose a termination method that isn't necessarily the best one, that's okay. You still have done at least some of the right things, and your soil is going to be better for it. So think about planting some cover crops, and go to solelyrested.com/soil to get all of those resources, and hopefully they will help you out. So that is it for today. Thanks for listening, friends. Remember, it's easy to forget how blessed we are to live this life. So enjoy the simple everyday efforts. It's not easy, but it's worth it.